Hello class, this is Del Ballou, your instructor, and today we're going to continue to work on the sand, and once we get the sand in, we're going to go back and do a little bit more work. Now, of course, I don't know where your water and your wet sand might be in conjunction with mine, but I want to really go over some more of those, I guess you call them tactics. And I use a soft synthetic brush, and I apply my paint in rather short strokes. And I leave it a little bit, what would you call it, sort of dots and dashes. And then at some point, if I have too much busyness going on, then while it's wet, I can go back and blend some areas. And as I say many times, knowing when to blend and when not to blend is actually very important. But that's something that you have to learn as you go along. And today, as I said, I'm going to work on this sand as well. So let me work up here for a while so that by the time I get down here, I won't have to interrupt that and get my hand in it like I did the last time. Okay, so I'm going to use this small brush, and this brush is a Royal and Langnickel brush, and it's a number 4. And it's also a chisel brush, and it's angled, as I think you can see here. And I'm just going to work from the notion that I have to do some highlights with my incoming and outgoing waves. This is a little less finished over here, because as I recall, when I was working on it, I had the camera set up in such a way that you really couldn't see it very well. So what I'm doing is putting down some of the bubble areas, the foam, maybe that's a better word for what I'm talking about. And the idea is that this is the remains of a wave that has come and gone. And I'm using some of these brush strokes that I had left from my last painting session. Now, the one thing you don't want to do is do that sort of scallopy repetition. Just go through and find some areas to indicate where the water has been. And it's really nice when you can do it on top of a dark line, because that gives you your shadow already and you don't have to go back and work on that again. Especially around these edges. I'm not picking up a lot of paint on my brush. And I'm accentuating some of these breaking waves. You don't want all of those to be exactly the same. Breaking waves begin as a dark, from the visual perspective, start off as a dark line, and then as the wave starts to roll on over, it's beginning to roll at this stage, but as it begins to roll over, then it becomes these white foamy areas. So I'm leaving some of those dark areas to indicate that these are precursor to the actual wave. These waves, especially at low tide, don't often break too far back. If you have a good bit of paint on your brush, then when you touch, it will deposit little fuzzy marks. Now I'm going to mix a little bit of my mud color here. Which is made up of Prussian and a little bit of cadmium red light. And I add white to that too, to see if I have the right mixture. So I want it to be gray. And if you have some Payne's gray, you can actually add just a touch of that. I wouldn't use too much. And I'm going to lighten what I have now because it's a tad too dark. Okay, one thing I'm doing here is lightening the sand, but as I put that sand in, I'm coming right up to the areas where there would be shadows. And that will save me from having to paint those shadows in at a later time. And this is where the smaller brush is probably not the best one, but I'm not ready to give it up just yet. Each time I pick up paint, I'm picking up and putting a little bit of white into my mixture, which on my palette is a little bit too dark. But when I put my paintbrush into the white and then bring it to the canvas, it's giving me a little bit of variation, which really is what I'm aiming for. And you also notice that I'm going into different sections of this portion, which also gives me a little variation. And it's pretty important that you get your water like you want it before you get down to the sea oats, because they're going to be coming up through that portion, and when they do, they will make it difficult to change what you've done here. And this side of the painting over here is not going to have much in the way of an intrusion, so it needs to have some interest. So this is where the irregular blending will help. I'm putting in some more shadows in my waves while I have that color mixed up. And the color for the gray mixture is made up of Prussian blue, some cadmium red light, and some alizarin crimson. And if it's too gray, you can add a touch of green or a very slight touch of yellow, because the complement of purple is yellow. But if you put too much yellow into it, it's going to turn green, and you don't want that. So just sort of be careful. And one of the ways that you find out how gray it is to put a little bit of white beside your mixture, and then touch a little bit of the mixture in it, because the white will immediately tell you what you need to do with your color. I want to show you what not to do. This painting did not get a lot of finishing touches, but I notice here that these are, well, for one thing, they're a tad too dark. So you want to gray them down a little bit more and make sure they're not too linear, because in fact these shadows are like everything else in this painting. They're affected by the light. They're not little lines. Okay, I'm fairly well satisfied with that so far. I can go back and work on this if I feel that I need to. But what I want to do now is work more on my sand. And if you already have your sand too solid and too white, you probably don't need to do this part, because the idea is to have your darker color so that it can show at certain places. So I'm using a flat white bristle brush, and this is a good size for this size painting, and it's a number 8 Winsor and Newton, but any brand, any brush will do. Now, this is very important that I noticed in working with students. For this scumbling, you have to have your brush flat on the canvas, just as if you're not holding it at all. But when you hold it with your hand over the top. And I usually let my index finger guide and put the pressure that I want. So if you're doing this, you're not going to get the same results. Or if you're doing this, you're not going to get the same results. For what I'm trying to get you to do here is to keep that brush flat, and I'm going to be putting just pure white paint, and these are going to be my highlight areas. I've already established those with my the beginnings of my grass. So I'm just sort of touching those. To make it seem as though the sand is piled up there. And then I want to trail off. I've left some spots here to give me some footprints in the sand, so I'm not going to be messing with those too much. And don't worry if you cover up the tips of your grasses, because they're only there for place markers right now. This is not an extremely bright day that I'm creating. I'm bringing my dry sand up a little bit here. I circled around at that point because I had a clump that I wanted to work in, but for the most part you should keep your scumbling on a more or less horizontal direction. And I'm not using any medium in this brush at all. The very first time I picked the brush up this morning, I did dip it into my turpentine, but just to wet it, and then I rinsed or squeezed all of that turpentine out of my brush. Because you want that mottled effect. Let me see if I can get that down so you can see what I'm talking about. I can still see the gray in there. Again, notice that I'm holding my brush flat against my canvas. I'm going to work over here some, my thicker paint. And again, this is called scumbling. Because what I'm doing is just dragging across the canvas so that the texture of the canvas is doing the work for me. And when you start to work on these sea oats and the grass underneath them in these areas, like right in here, you can always go back and darken that a little bit if you need to. But the one thing that's difficult if you cover it up is this nice texture that I'm getting from my scumbling. That would almost demand that you do the process all over again by painting the gray underneath. So save yourself some steps. I will be adding some more grass. In fact, probably lots more grass. That isn't coming up out of sand drifts. And that's pretty much what these are. This paint is a little thicker, and I'm not touching it as hard because I don't want to blend it in. And actually, painting snow and sand are very similar. And this is an area where, in the world of our painting, where the sand is rather thick, as sand is apt to be. And when people walk on sand, they are disturbing it, and they are pushing clumps of sand up, and then that creates a shadow underneath. Now, I'll be a little bit more definite about this later, but right now I just want to give the indication of sand that's been disturbed. Okay, I think that's all I'm going to do on that right now, and once it dries, I'll come back and put some more grass in. While I have a little bit of white on my dry brush, I'm going to put in some suggestions. Of the areas where the former tide has left little love notes. Okay, that was cheesy, sorry. Okay, so I'm going to call that a session, and I'm sorry, I just now realized my son is intruding